analysis or go over some of the big things that the commission is working on. And so we do this often, but it's usually in a smaller room because, but on this particular issue, we have a lot of interest. And so we wanted to hold it in here and get everyone together. I want to remind everybody that we're going to break before our normal commission meeting at least 10 minutes beforehand. And so I want to remind the commissioners, we'll take a break to do that. And so this particular, and so I want to also remind the commissioners, this is public, it is a public meeting. And so we make sure that any comments are just kind of like a committee. We're not deliberating, so you can ask questions. And so I just want to remind the commissioners that it is a public meeting, but it's not a normal public commission meeting regularly called. It's a workshop. And so we have Mr. Claxton, Greg Claxton, who has been with us for a long time, handles a lot of good things, and he's going to cover housing and infrastructure and the things that we're working on. And commissioners, please, if you have questions, this is the time to ask. And we appreciate Greg coming and presenting the information. Mr. Claxton, or Director, do you want to say anything? Nope. Okay, we'll hand it over to Mr. Claxton. Go ahead, Greg.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, Commissioners. I'm going to walk through an update on the housing and infrastructure study. As y'all will recall from your December meeting, this is something that Council requested last March. We've been kind of pulling together the elements that we need, and now we've gotten the project underway. I'm going to talk through kind of three themes of the project: abundant housing, necessary infrastructure, and distinctive communities towards the back half of the presentation. But I'm going to start with kind of our overall project approach, sort of how we've structured, how we're thinking about the work that's entailed with this. And so broadly, our approach is structured around three questions. The first is, what is it that stands in the way of building housing that works for all Nashvillians? And so to answer this, we're starting with determining the level of future housing demand and seeing how much of that demand can be accommodated within the current zoning map. This is one of the things I'm going to spend some time on at the end, so I'm going to come back and talk about that in more detail. The second piece is assessing our current zoning and building codes and the zoning map to identify barriers to moderately priced housing. And one thing I'm going to kind of pause and just make sure is clear in kind of what we're approaching, kind of what the topic of inquiry is for us, is this is really looking at market rate housing, what the private sector is doing to provide housing for Nashvillians. A lot of what we're doing is in concert with a unified housing strategy. A lot of it comes out of the Affordable Housing Task Force from several years ago. Those have a really big focus on specifically affordable housing, or you might say subsidized housing or income restricted housing. Only a very small part of this study addresses that. The broader set of scope of what this is looking at is what the private sector does. And that puts a different set of kind of frames around how we think about things. One is I'm going to talk a lot about sort of demand and the amount of housing that we need. That is not something that Metro provides directly. That is something that the rules and regulations of the zoning code and the building code shape where and how and what kind of housing is produced. And so we want to be mindful and good stewards of that and make sure it's aligned to what our needs are. But it is not first and foremost about things that Metro is going out to produce.
And Greg, the Affordable Housing Task Force recommended that we do this type of analysis.
Exactly.
So it had a lot of recommendations around affordable and subsidized housing, and then there was a piece that was around land use zoning and codes that looked at this market piece, and that's what we're pursuing as a recommendation of the Affordable Housing Task Force. Thank you, Greg.
Mm-hmm. And so as part of this approach, we're going to be looking at new housing typologies. These are kinds of homes that are, they exist in Nashville, but they're not kind of regularly produced in our current market. And then develop draft new zoning code amendments to allow them. These may be things like cottage courts, certain formations of townhomes, triplexes, fourplexes, those kinds of things. And then we'll also be looking at the financial feasibility of these different housing types across the county. So we want to make sure that as we're thinking about the kinds of housing that Nashvillians need, the kind that our zoning code allows, we want to also make sure that kind of anything that we're doing to allow them is actually financially feasible, that that's going to work for the private market to provide. And so as we think about kind of the financial feasibility across the county, that leads to our next question, which is where should we add housing to meet Nashvillians' vision for the future? And so for this, one of the things that we'll be doing is looking at alternate zoning scenarios to show how the code amendments can help us meet our anticipated housing demand. And by that, I mean broadly within the framework of Nashville Next, and I'll talk about that some more in a moment. What are different ways that we can meet that housing demand? We don't think that there's one way to do it. We think that there's kind of different choices and different trade-offs that the commission, the council, and the public will have as a result of the study. And so we want to kind of explore what those are to help inform that deliberation. These scenarios are mostly going to be based on available infrastructure and the economic feasibility of those building types. Again, I'm going to talk about this in a little bit more detail at the end. And then because we've got the financial feasibility of these types assessed, we'll be able to talk a little bit about the likely affordability levels of these typologies. Again, this is sort of if the private sector were to purchase land, build this, and then sell or rent it, what's kind of the range of prices or the range of rents that they'd kind of be able to provide that at. One area in which we are getting a little bit into affordable housing, income restricted housing here, is looking at the potential to use a new tool that the state has enabled, which is affordability bonuses. This is additional development entitlements or additional kind of ability to do something that's not otherwise authorized in exchange for some set aside of affordable units. That's not the main focus of that, but we thought that this was a good opportunity to look at that option that the state has given us. And then last, we want to think about what infrastructure and amenities are necessary to support the level of housing growth that we anticipate. And so some of this are sort of critical infrastructure pieces that you've got to have to provide sort of adequate and safe housing, such as transportation access, water and sewer, stormwater management, and then proximity to fire stations as well. But then there's a broader set of facilities and amenities we want to be mindful of as well that help to create complete neighborhoods. So these are things like parks, libraries, grocery stores. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about this at the end as well. So that's our broad approach. There's a couple things on each of our themes: abundant housing, necessary infrastructure, and distinctive communities, that I'm going to dig into in a little bit more detail. And so for the abundant housing piece, I want to talk about our understanding of what level of housing need we have and how much housing we can build under current rules. I presented these charts at the December briefing. Generally speaking, these are showing the level of growth that we've had around jobs, households, and our population compared to what our expectations were from Nashville Next. And in particular, the households one in the middle, which is what drives housing demand, is far above what we were anticipating. Some of that is, sort of the higher level of job and population growth, but some of that is just people choosing different ways in which to form households. And so because we had this sort of divergence from the forecast that we had from Nashville Next and what we've seen, we wanted to take a look and start by as we think about future demand, we start with kind of the sources of forecast that we have available to us. So two of these I've put up on this screen. One is the State Data Center. This is out of the Boyd Center at UT. We work closely with the State Data Center because they're our conduit to the Census Bureau. So anytime new census data comes out, we're in touch with them. We're in touch with them as they update their forecast, that kind of thing. The other is from a national firm called Woods & Poole. This is what the Greater Nashville Regional Council uses when they put together the 5-year regional transportation plan. An earlier version of this was what we used in Nashville Next for our forecast. And so what we've done is taken these forecasts that look out different time periods from a different starting point and brought them down to look at 10-year demand for housing. And so from these two, we expect that we might expect 20 to 30,000 units demanded in Nashville or needed in Nashville over the next 10 years. This is in line with the forecast that we had during Nashville Next. But as I've said, it would be a significant step down from the actual level of building activity, the actual job growth, the actual population growth that we've seen since then. So as our housing team got underway with the unified housing strategy, we knew a big part of that was going to be looking at the housing market and saying what kind of demand, what kind of units, what kind of affordability levels do people in Nashville need. And we made a really big point that we thought it was necessary to look beyond the current forecast that we have and put together a custom forecast for Nashville because of this divergence. So what they've done is taken national economic trends by industry sector, so leisure and hospitality, manufacturing, healthcare, education, that kind of thing, and applied it to Nashville, given our mix of those industries. They've then taken historic trends and allocated workers and people and households to Nashville and the broader region. Then we've checked that against like other ways that we've done, looked at this in the past. So for example, if we kept up with the broader region's growth, where would that put us? And so what they've put together is in line with the other looks that we've had. And so if the existing forecasts that we have are kind of 20 to 30,000 units over 10 years, the UHS demand estimate is 90,000 units over the next 10 years. That's 9,000 units a year, which is down a little bit from the very peak of the last 2 or 3 years of housing production, where we've gotten to 10 or 12 or 13,000 units a year. It's a little bit higher than what we saw sort of just up to the pandemic, where we were maybe 7, 8, we might have gotten to 9,000 units in 1 year. So what we're looking at here is sustaining a high level of housing production over 10 years to meet the full housing demand that we anticipate. Now, because we had this experience of this other forecast missing the mark, one of the things we really want to highlight is that there are still uncertainties. This is not locked in. This is not a given. So growth could be faster or slower than we expect, and we take both sides of that seriously. Even if the overall job forecast or the overall population forecast is in line with what happens, there could still be another shift in household formation, again, up or down, leading to a higher or lower demand for new homes. And then we want to be really mindful of the balance between opportunities for home ownership and renting. So one of the sources of so much housing production over the past 5 years has been a very large number of multifamily homes, especially in downtown and midtown. And so we want to make sure, especially based on emerging guidance from the UHS, that we are as mindful to home ownership opportunities as we are to sort of rental opportunities. So those are all sources of uncertainty that we want to be ready for. And so because of that, even though our expectation is that there may be 90,000 units needed in Nashville over the next 10 years, we expect, and this is something we're still working on, but we expect to provide a little bit of a buffer to reflect that uncertainty. And so again, that's something we're still working on, but it's probably going to be in the range of 15 to 25,000 additional units. Now, that's all kind of what we think we need to use for kind of going through this process and laying out how we can accommodate demand for living in Nashville. The final piece here is how much do we think we can build out under the current zoning code as applied in the current zoning map, again, over that next 10-year period. So to do this, we've put together a model where we've looked at the past 10 years of permitting activity. That's the map on the right, where we went through and identified for every permit that added new housing, how many units were added, where was it located, and what form did it take? So was it a single family home, detached? Was it an attached single family home, a detached accessory unit, or multifamily? So we coded all of that. We looked at what are the characteristics of the parcels that added those units, or that added more or fewer of those units. How close were they to downtown? How big was the parcel? How big was the building, if there was a building on it? What was the income of the neighborhood that was in it? Like all of these different factors we brought together to model what seemed to be sort of driving whether a permit was issued and how many units were issued. And so the way that we use this is, again, looking at every parcel in the county based on the last 10 years of permitting. Our starting point is, how many units do we think each parcel could produce above what it's currently got? And so for small parcels, this may be 1 or 2 or 3 units. It could be half a unit in some cases, or it could be for large parcels or for multifamily parcels downtown. It could be 100, 200, many number of units. But we don't stop there, because I want you to think a little bit about the Major and Collector Street Plan. These are major roads in Nashville that mostly have commercial zoning. For the past 15 or 20 years, those have all allowed significant multifamily construction through a provision we call adaptive residential. But most of those don't build out for residential. Most of them are just commercial buildings, usually pretty low slung. And so and that's part of what we want to capture here, is not just how many units could you fit on a site, but what is the likelihood of that happening? And again, we calculate that out for every parcel in the county.
So Greg, just to use that example, is it fair to say we think we have zoning capacity on the corridors, but that's not been expressed for some reason, and we want to understand why we haven't seen more residential development on the corridors since it's allowed, right, by zoning, but something is holding it back, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. And it's just, to a certain extent, it's just people have businesses on them, people are using it for something else, the market's not right, other stuff is going on nearby. And so there's a lot of things that go into this. It's not purely like it's not allowed. It's just, it doesn't like, we build a lot of housing, but across all 250,000 parcels, only a few of them have actually redeveloped. But what we do is we take the number of units we expect on a parcel and the chance of it happening, and we multiply those together, and that's the build-out potential. That's what we use to see, do we have enough supply do we have enough opportunities for supply for the next 10 years? So I know that's very abstract, but let me try to sort of put a couple of numbers to that just to show you kind of how the math works. So if you imagine like a large community of about 40,000 parcels, this is a lot of homes, a lot of those commercial sites on corridors. We might model this out and say across all 40,000 parcels, you could add under zoning maybe 50,000 additional units. But on average across all of those, it may only be a 1% chance of any one parcel actually adding any units. And so when we multiply that together, that only gets us 500 likely units. And so like that's significant, that's important. It feels like a big change if you're in the community, but it's a small part of kind of the overall demand that we see. And so again, if we are expecting 90,000 units over the next 10 years, we want to be ready for 110, 120,000 units. We think under the current map, under the current zoning rules, over that next 10-year period, we're likely to see around 70,000 units. And so I want to talk a little bit about that number, because there's a few things that are noteworthy about that to me. One is that it's not nothing. Like it's not that we can't build anything. There's a lot of opportunities out there. A lot of those are on the corridors, like we were just talking about. But there's areas of single-family zoning, kind of in the suburban parts and neighborhood evolving areas. There's infill opportunities. There's different things out there. So it's not that there's no opportunities. It's also not an insane huge number. Like it's not 1 million units. It's 70,000, which is short of what we need. And so that's what we want to use housing and infrastructure is to explore. What does it take to close that gap? And what does it take to close that gap with the kind of housing that the best data that we have suggests Nashvillians need? One final point on this housing piece, which is that it's not just a matter of the total number. Because we're doing this for individual parcels, we can also ask where. Where are we likely to add these homes? Are we growing in line with Nashville Next? Are new units exposed to environmental hazards such as floodplains or air pollution from interstates? Are all parts of the county contributing their part? Are we likely to add enough homes for ownership and renting? Are they in places well served by infrastructure? So these are all different ways of getting at sort of the core thing, which is separate from the one main countywide number. Do we have enough capacity to support the growth that we anticipate in the areas that Nashvillians have broadly agreed we want to see growth happen, and in the forms that we want to see growth happen? So that's a nuance that sort of takes a little step further from just the pure gap of demand versus anticipated supply.
Greg, let's see if anybody has any questions before we go on to the infrastructure piece. We can keep going.
Thanks, Greg. A lot of times, so I know that we're Nashville focused. Are we going to do an analysis of the region, say donut counties, or are we going to, does GNRC have that data, or do other entities or the MPO, or how are we looking at, also, I think there's a regional calculation that I feel like I'm interested in it, or at least we should be thinking about that, maybe?
Yes, so we're not looking at that within this process, but we do have a critical linkage to GNRC as they update the regional transportation plan, where they're doing a similar analysis. So they won't be able to do the build-out analysis that I just showed, but through their land use modeling software, which we also have access to, they'll do a similar version. It just takes a different approach, but they'll look at kind of growth patterns throughout the region. One of the things that we've done is we've gotten access to the underlying software that they use. So the same method that they use to do the regional plan, we will do for us as well. That's kind of a parallel effort that we're looking at. And that's critical because one of the big questions we're raising is the region planning enough, anticipating enough housing in Nashville? And so there's going to be a little bit of a gap, going back to the Woods and Pool projection, where they're expecting a lower level of growth for us than we expect. So that's something we'll provide to them and sort of talk through sort of why, how we came up with that number, what we think it means, and we'll kind of work through with them whether that has implications for the regional transportation plan.
Commissioner?
Thank you, Chairman. Listen, I heard you say that there would be units on parcels, but I also heard you talk about a half unit. Mm-hmm. What is a half unit?
So a half unit, it's a great question. So one of the things that the model recognizes is that in some cases, some of the development happens in a way that isn't really captured by the current parcel boundaries. And so, for example, about 10 years ago, 3 houses behind me were all acquired by a single developer, torn down, and replaced by 5 units. And so if you try to sort of represent that in the model, it's not that any one of those would add a full unit. It's that it would add like 2/3 or a half of a unit. So it's reflecting that across 90,000 single-family homes in Nashville, a few of those will get torn down and replaced by 2 or 3 or 4. On average, it's a fraction of a unit, but if you kind of add up the opportunity for that across all 90,000, it's a number worth taking seriously as part of this.
Any other questions? I think Commissioner Clifton and then Commissioner Smith. Did you have a question, Commissioner Clifton? Oh, you're Commissioner Clifton always takes good care of me, right? Commissioner Smith, go ahead.
You may have already said this. I was a few minutes late, I apologize. Does the 90,000 number represent just the growth in household formation and immigration to the city, et cetera? Or does it assume we're caught up now? Or how does that?
So it does not, so it has 2 main pieces. One is growth, but also getting to a healthy vacancy rate. Especially on the ownership side, the sort of the stock of available homes for sale has been under a healthy level for like 10 or 15 years now. On the rental side, we've only just gotten up to a healthy vacancy rate the last year or so. So it's looking for both of those to come up to a healthy level.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions, Commissioner? Commissioner Allen?
Can you explain again what affordability bonuses are?
Sure. So this is something where the state has allowed us to structure a program so that if a private developer comes in on property they own, and if they're entitled to build, and I'm going to talk generally, this isn't necessarily how the program would be structured. If they're entitled to build 3 stories of residential, they may be able to get like a 4th story in exchange for providing some number of those units and ensuring that they're affordable for some period of time.
It just was passed this last term, and so it would be a new program, and we're figuring out how to construct it and test it with the private market to see if the standards that we consider through this process will actually accomplish the housing delivery.
Any other questions? Vice Chair, do you have a question? No? Oh, Commissioner Dundon.
Okay, sorry. Just along the lines of the affordability bonus, we've had cases and developments before us where there's been commentary in the presentations that the developer is putting aside a certain number of units for affordable housing, and I'm wondering how that is that something completely different than, I mean, it must be if the affordability bonus is new, but can you kind of talk a little bit about what the difference is between where we've heard that happen before and what the affordability bonus might be?
Sure. So the affordability bonus is something that would be, again, it's a new program. We're sort of exploring kind of how to structure it and how to set up kind of the ratios between number of units and what the bonus is. So a little bit speculative. I think, in my understanding, the distinction would be when someone comes to you for a zone change, the affordability wouldn't necessarily be part of that conversation. Like, that's something that over the past several years, I think legal has advised the commission not to consider that because that can't be a condition. Instead, what this allows is once someone has a base zone, like a zoning district, that includes that bonus, when they go for a building permit, that is something that they can say, we're going to commit to this, affordability that complies with the program, and here's the bonus. And so it's at the building permit level rather than when someone seeks to change their entitlements.
Okay, so
I realize that's a nuance, and the laws have changed so much over the last several years about how and whether and when we can account for affordability in a zoning decision. So I think it's become very fraught, and I wouldn't blame you for wondering, well, why can we weigh in here if not here? And we will do some really good work sessions once we have that regime in place so that you will feel comfortable in your decisions about when we could apply that standard in a rezoning.
okay. Do you all feel like this affordability bonuses are really going to change the incentives to include affordable housing in a dramatic or otherwise way?
That's what we're studying here.
Okay,
We would like for them to make a meaningful impact. I think we are still at a point where we're trying to figure out if you have a base entitlement and you're allowed, to Greg's point, 3 stories, what would it take on that piece of land for you to add incrementally more? And what's the mechanism that we can ensure that that's protected? And so there's just a lot of stress testing of the new, we're happy that the state passed that opportunity for us, and there's just some stress testing to figure out how to get it done.
Thank you.
Yeah, hold on one second, Commissioner. I'll get right to you. The important thing too on this is, the department does a great job in running it by legal, and so legal has to do an analysis. Our commission has generally been ripe with litigation, whether it's a neighborhood suing the commission or whether it's a developer suing the commission. It happens often, and so we want to make sure that liability is not set up. So they do a good job at reviewing that, and the department works really closely with legal, and so it's important to do that. Commissioner, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm wondering if it's passed, would that be applied retroactively between? Might think about that.
I
You
don't
can't
know.
do that, can
I
you?
don't think so, but we will definitely put that question in the hopper.
Yeah, we can. Generally, retroactivity is pretty hard legally, but we'll find out. Yeah. Even Commissioner knows that. Even Commissioner Clifton fights with retroactivity sometimes. No.
You're gonna have to get between them.
No. Any other? No, this is good, commissioners. This is what these workshops are for. Is for us to think about this and interact with the staff, and so the team knows what we're thinking and questions. And I appreciate it. This is really good discussion. And any other discussion for Mr. Claxton, and then we'll move on. So, Greg, you have approximately 17 minutes.
All right.
No, 7 minutes. I'm sorry. We're going to try 3:45 so we can take a break, but you can go over a little bit, okay? So maybe 8 minutes.
So the next thing I'm going to touch on with a much lighter touch than the housing piece are some of the implications for infrastructure as we think about managing growth within the growth and preservation concept map. We want to think not just about new growth, but addressing current deficiencies, how we transform the centers on this map from auto-oriented to walkable and transit-oriented places, how we support Metro's overall financial sustainability. And what I'm going to talk about a little bit more right now is the increasing difficulties that we have in getting infrastructure with development. And so the example I'm going to talk through is how we create a connected street network. So I've got policy language from T3 Suburban Neighborhood Evolving. But broadly speaking, street connectivity is something we see as tying together a lot of important elements for quality of life. The ability to have a flexible street network that gives people multiple ways to get around without dumping kind of all of the cars onto one big road. If that road has an accident or is shut down for some other reason, it has huge implications for people's ability to get to where they need to go. That doesn't just affect everyday travelers. An incomplete street network may mean that it takes longer for fire trucks, for example, to get to fires. At the extreme, it may mean that we need to build and staff more fire stations to serve the same number of residents, which increases the cost of providing services for Nashvillians. Street connectivity is something we're spending an increasing amount of time on, particularly Lisa and the land development team, recognizing that from the last 10 or 20 years, it's not something we've been able to keep up with, kind of making and forging those connections. I'm showing a couple of examples that staff have worked on from our Tuesday meeting this week, recognizing where we have a stub street circled in yellow that leads into vacant or open land, where we want to build out that future connectivity, generally shown with the dashed red lines, but that there are practical problems, such as gaps in ownership or topography. Our ability to make these street connections often hinges on what kind of process the project is going through. So as you all know, we are often able to get street connections through the subdivision process or when a developer is pursuing an SP. But if someone comes in for a building permit that just goes to the front counter at codes, we often can't get that. And so we're increasingly working closely with finance and NDOT to identify when there are critical segments that are in danger of development and pursue property acquisition.
And Greg, just given, I know we're on a short timeline, I think part of the reason I asked you to include this is I want the commission to know that when we have debates and internal discussions about where to place housing, often we're looking at areas where we think housing is appropriate. There's a main corridor that you see here, but we don't have a very good process within Metro to address very basic pieces of infrastructure connectivity to support that housing. And so part of what we want to say to the commission and then also back to Metro Council, who has a really important role in establishing the streets, is there are some parts of the city where we think housing is very appropriate. There may not be environmental issues, it may be right close to a corridor, but that are simply not built out. And we need to create a process with Metro Council and planning, but also fiscally to anticipate how we can support these areas. We'll often hear from housing developers, we can do the development, but the cost of getting the land ready is prohibitive. And so there's definitely a model that we need to figure out here. And so you'll see this with the streets as well as the water and some other things. So this is great.
And then the last piece I wanted to highlight is as we think about distinctive communities, their distinctive characters, but also their distinctive needs. And so, I've mentioned before, we've talked at great length about Nashville Next, our set of guiding principles of what it is we're hoping to achieve, as well as the growth and preservation concept map. That's underlaid by the transect, kind of the distinct characters of different parts of the county, rural, suburban, and urban, that shape kind of people's daily lives and what their expectations are for what makes a neighborhood. And so a process that's going on alongside this, some internal work we're doing around developing neighborhood planning guidelines. This is something that will be informed by housing and infrastructure and may inform some of what we're doing, but is probably going to head toward its own update within Nashville Next. Here we're thinking about what are the elements that make a neighborhood, like boundaries and landmarks, but also what are the elements that constitute the places that bring people together. Places to shop, places to, schools, churches, those kind of things. And how does the arrangement and the location of these differ by transect? We're working on a toolkit of how to integrate that into our long-range planning program. A A couple things I want to highlight within housing and infrastructure is how we think about the public realm, especially open space, and how we think about sort of the program for land uses. So we're thinking in terms of parks, libraries and community centers, grocery stores, healthcare, childcare, and banks. And what is the available supply of those? How much of those are provided? What's the demand for those? How far away from people? And how do people navigate sort of the different opportunities? You may have 4 or 5 parks that you go to, depending on your mood, the weather, what your kids are interested in. And so just recognizing those different opportunities and how that changes throughout the county. We're looking to sort of bring that all together and help provide some insight into what opportunities people have access to, how that changes as we grow, and where there may be opportunities to bring alignment with the capital improvements budget, or what the market may be interested in from like grocery stores, and kind of where the market is for that kind of thing. And that is the end of this very long presentation.
Greg, you did it on time.
Good job, Greg.
I think a lot of great things happening, and I do want to thank the council lady for always working harder and working longer hours with us, and always appreciate your support on the council. And as you know, it's a critical partnership between the commission and the team, and also the council. And so we really appreciate it and thank you. And I want to thank Greg and the team and the director. It's really good stuff. So this is the time where we're going to wrap this up. But if you have questions, ask the director, ask Greg, and he'll be, even if you want to sit down, even if you want to meet with them, and if you have more questions, or it's time, this is the time to do it. And that's why we wanted to bring the report to you and kind of what's happening. And so, Greg, thank you very much. And so, commissioners, we're going to take a 15-minute break, and we will start the regular Planning Commission meeting at hopefully right around 4 o'clock. So if everybody could be back, take a break, and be ready at 4 o'clock. Thanks, Greg.
This has been a service of the Metro Nashville Network. If you would like to see this presentation again, or for more information on this and other programs, visit nashville.gov.